Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So, as I said last time, that we are going to look at the different types of fires and also the impact or effect they have on organisms which live in the soil or underneath the ground. So you need to also remember that the fire is one kind of disturbance. So it has some intensities. So fire of different intensities will impact on a vegetation differently. Some would stimulate growth, some would destroy and make sure that nothing is left behind. And others fires might destroy but then leave the underground propagules. That's where now we tend to see the secondary succession occurring. So then we are just going to look at the three classes of fires, and then we look at the impact of fire on soil biota, and also we're going to look at some other different topics that we haven't covered as yet. So we're saying that fire must be included as an evolutionary force in the development of communities, particularly those which are subjected to lightning. So it has influenced the evolution of species of the forest, grasslands, and also shrub communities. So we have different classes of fires according to their intensities. So we have got the surface fire, the crown fire, and the ground fire. So these are grouped based on their impact or the way they impact on the ecosystem or vegetation. So looking at the surface fire, you say that the surface fire, it burns the upper litter and the small branches that lie on or near the ground. So the surface fire, it usually moves rapidly because it's only on the surface and it does not consume all the organic layer. So the heat pulse, which is generated at the burning of the front of this fast-moving fire, it does not normally persist long enough to cause damages to the tissues and also the underground roots, the bugs, and also the large trees. So this is how a surface fire would seem to be impacting on the ecosystem. So it only moves on the surface, burning only the surfaces, the surface litter, and not the barks of the tree because of the fuel load, which means its fuel load is not that much. That is why it's not doing much damage. Then we have what we call the crown fires. So the crown fires, they occur when the surface fire or the ground fire ignites slash piles the dead or living lower branches of the trees. The tree crowns become engulfed in the flames and the fire spreads to nearby trees. So the crown fire occurs in the forest during the periods of drought and low relative humidity. So particularly in areas with heavy accumulation of understory materials called the ladder fuel. So for example, the fallen trees, logging lash, the combustible understory vegetation. So you remember when we talk about the understory vegetation, we were talking about the lower laying vegetation which is found under the large trees. So you find that those trees tend to die off, and then when they die off, they leave some biomass on the ground. So those are the ones which you find that the crown fires are feeding on. So the crown fires, they generate a tremendous amount of heat that rises in a strong convection column, so drawing in brisk surface winds that fans the flame even more. So heated air blowing across the flames also warms and dries the fuel ahead of the fire. So which means that it increases the intensity now, and also the speed of the fire, and also increasing the dry weight ahead of the fire. So the crown fires have environmental effects similar to those of the ground fires, as you will see, by killing all the trees and the shrubs in their path. So similar to ground fire, the crown fires only stop by running out of fuel, or if the precipitation cools the fire down or wets the fuel sufficiently. So this is how a crown fire would seem to be appearing in nature. So you can see it bends from the ground going up into the crown. So this is why we call it the crown fire, because it also consumes the crown, in fact the whole plant, destroying each and every part of the plant. And then we have the ground fires. So the ground fires, they're saying that they normally smolder and creep slowly through the litter and humus layer, which means they consume all and most organic cover and exposing mineral soil and underlying rocks. So these fires usually only occur during the periods of protracted drought, when the entire soil organic layer may dry sufficiently, but they may burn for weeks or even months until precipitations and low temperature extinguish the fire, or they run out of fuel. So this is how detrimental the ground fire is. As you can see, it smolders because it moves very slowly because of the high fuel load. You find the dead logs there, many dry matter there, which means now the fire sort of kills everything in its path. And that's why we say that it may last for weeks or even months if not controlled or managed. So they generally kill large and small trees because of long and high temperature heat pulse. So they release considerable amounts of nutrients from the burnt fuels. They destroy many small organisms and the fungi that lives in the humus and organic layers. So they also consume seed soils in the litter and kills roots in the deep soil. So these two kinds of fires, the crown and the ground fires, they are not recommended when you want to manage the ecosystem. So ecosystems such as your grasslands and the savanna ecosystems are seen to be controlled or managed using the surface fire, because what we do is decrease or reduce the fuel load such that the fire which will be applied, it will be of low intensity, which means it will only burn the upper surfaces. And also there will be people who are going to be watching the spread of such a fire. So the crown fire and the ground fire are not recommended for managing the ecosystem because of their devastating impacts on ecosystems. So they tend to increase the change of surface flow, the erosion on slope, and leave a baked and hardened seed bed that may prevent rapid vegetation. So increased surface runoff across exposed surface may carry away ash and dissolved nutrients, making the condition even less favorable for plant growth. And then we have the effects of fire on soil biota. So like I said, The intensity of fire also is the main factor here now when we talk about fire on the soil biota. So following fire, soil biota is commonly affected to varying degrees. So in general, it appears that soil will often protect subsurface soil biota from fire. So this level of protection is dependent upon the depth of the organism in relation to the depth of the heat penetration. So we're talking about the intensity now. How far does the fire reach deep down into the ground? Because different organisms, living organisms which are found underneath the soil or inside the soil, are found at different depths. So those ones which are closer to the surface are the ones which are going to be affected more and are the ones who are going to die first. Then different organisms get affected upon by the fire depending on how far they are found inside the soil. So in general, the hot fires typically have a more significant and longer lasting impact on the soil biota than the low intensity fires, which tend to have little or no effect on soil biota. So the safest fire, because it moves fast through the vegetation, it might affect just a few organisms or none at all, because it only moves on the surface. But then if you bring in the ground fire, then you are assured of the damage which is going to happen there. Then we have the interaction of fire and vegetation. So the grassland species that survive fire, they often benefit, because it is said that some of the grasses, they tend to have some silica content, so which enhance the resistance of decay and thereby provides more fuel for the next fire. So this silica acts as a defense mechanism for these grasses, because it protects them from damage and also from some sort of predation. So the more immediate advantage is the increased protection afforded the seeds that remain above the hottest part of the fire on fire-resistant stock, thus ensuring survival of the seeds. So the high silica content in some of the grasses served to select mammals that evolved ever-growing teeth with ridges that were sharpened by use. So frequent fire is the agent of soil nutrient renewal, releasing the nutrients from plant tissues and recycling them into new biomass. So we also have what we call the fire-adapted plants. So fire-induced, we have what we call fire-induced flowering. So the phenomenon of increased flowering and concomitant enhanced seed set would appear to be advantageous in two ways. So those plants that produce the increased number of seeds would be at a competitive advantage over those plants that are not much more adapted. So the seed bed, which receives more light due to canopy removal and has a deposit of soluble mineral ash nutrients, provides an additional opportunity for enhanced growth and reproduction. Then you also find that these so-called fire-induced flowering, if there is no fire, you find that their flowering becomes very poor, which means they need fire fire now acts as a stimulant for their flowering. Then the bud protection and subsequent sprouting. So the buds near the base of the shrub may survive fire and be released from dormancy by the death of shoots above them. So it's more like succession. When the other one dies off, the other one is given a chance. So sprouting results as a hormonal response or with the onset of the winter rains. So the sprouting may be from the stem or maybe from the basal bud or what we call a lignotubers. I hope we are familiar with what lignotubers are. So those are the tubers which are found on the plants, inside, on the roots. You find that the roots are swollen. Or a simple organism, an onion is a lignotuber because it has a tuber at the bottom. So the protection of the stem bud is provided for by the bark, and the lignotuber are protected by the soil. So those bulbs are protected by the soil. So in soil seed storage and fire stimulated germination, so you find that there are some species whose seeds remain dormant in the soil for so many years until there is fire. So if no fire occurs, no germination should occur. An example is some proteus species which needs some fire for them for germination to be stimulated. Another example is the seed of snow brush, which might remain viable in the forest litter for up to 575 years until the fear of the fire occurs. Then, if you realize we did not get into details with regard to ordination, so we are going to look into more details as to what ordination does and how we can go around trying to work our ways through there using different formulas. So we said that ordination, it attempts to summarize sampling data in simpler, less space-consuming fashion than the table or methods. So we have got what we call the polar ordination. So this is the method which was developed in the 1950s by Bray and Curtis in the upland forest of Wisconsin. So it arranges samples between endpoints or poles according to the distance matrix. So this method followed a fixed set of rules that can be done by a computer. So it is an intuitive method that is based on the Euclidean geometry, and it is said to be good for teaching. So this method have got 3 important steps which must be followed. So the third step can be done either by using a compass or calculations. So the steps in the calculation of the ordination, so the first one is to create a matrix of community coefficient values between all possible pairs of stands. Then begin with the primary data matrix, whereby rows represent the species and the columns represents the plot or the stand, as you will see in the example that we are going to give. So what we're going to do is to locate the 2 highly similar stands. So 2 highly similar stands are selected as endpoints on the horizontal axis. So in our case, stand A and B have an ID, index of difference of 80, which is the largest of all pairings from stands A to G. So the ID of 80 becomes 80 graph units on the axis 1. I hope you are following what I'm trying to say here. So these values are the index of difference. Like we're saying, we're not looking for similarity, we're trying to look for dissimilarity. So to find that, we have to say, since we're saying that it's supposed to be 100%, so to find the ID, we have to say 100 minus the community coefficient. So here, the community coefficient for G, for F2G, was 90. So we said 100 minus 90, and we found 10, which is the difference. For here, E to F, it was 86. And to find the community, the ID, we said 100 minus 86, which gave us 14. Same as here, it was, we have 30 cc. So to find the ID, you have to say 100 minus 30, and you find this one. For A to B, it's 80, because we had the community coefficient of 20. So 100 minus 20, it gives us 80. So the ID for A to B is 80. I hope you get where we're getting these IDs and how we're getting them. Then the third step is to transfer now the ID values into the graph. Since we said the aim for polar ordination is to arrange these things in a graph instead of the tables. So, as you can see, from A to B, it's 80 units. So after the endpoints A and B have been located on the axis 1, all other stands are located between them by swinging the arcs that correspond to the ID values, which with stands A and B. So for example, stand C has the ID of 63, with stand B with 67 with A. So the compass with the radius 67 units is swung from A, and a compass with the radius 63 is swung from B, forming two arcs. So the crossing arcs define a line which is perpendicular to the axis. Where the line crosses the axis is the location of stand C on the axis E. So this is on the axis E. There is what we call the measure of poorness of fit for stand C. Here, this small e there, this is the measurement of poorness. So here we used what? We used graphs to locate stand C. But then we can also avoid using the graphs and do it using the calculations. Then the calculation part of step 3, the location of stands on the axis can also be calculated instead of being plotted. So the location of stand C, for example, from the left end of the axis point A is equals to minus x equals to L squared plus DAC squared minus DBC over 2L. So x is the distance along the axis from the leaf end. L is the index of difference of the endpoint stand A and C, which is 80. DAC is just the ID between stands A and C. DBC is just the ID between the stand B and C. So you see, this is very simple. So therefore, X would be equals to 80 squared plus 67 squared minus 63 squared over 2 into 80. And then you calculate that and you locate your point. So X is 63. So this should be the simplest way. So calculating now the measure of poorness, which is the E, the community coefficient E, is the measure of poorness of feed for stand C, and it can be calculated as follows. A is equals to the square root of DAC squared minus X squared. So DAC, we know, is 67 squared minus X squared, which X we had found in our previous example there. A will then be equals to 67 minus 1849, which is minus 1782. So E will then varies from each point on the line. If one point has the high E value, it does not fit in the line well, and therefore does not really belong next to the other point. So this is how it would appear. So the community coefficient values. So the above community similarity matrix represents 7 hypothetical stands, which are stands A to G. So they are showing the community coefficients, different numbers there, which you see. So the community coefficient value ranges from 90 to 20. If you can see, stand A has got nothing there. So we are going to show you how we get to calculate these different things. So the steps in the calculation, therefore, of the ordination. So the second step is to calculate the matrix of dissimilarity rather than similarity. So the maximum possible dissimilarity between stands is 100%. For each pair of stands has an index of difference, which is equals to 100 minus the community coefficient value. So the index of difference, or the community dissimilarity matrix for 7 stands showing indices of differences. So these are the index of difference. And remember, here we had 90, now we have 10, because we're saying that the CC here, we're saying that for each pair of stands has an index of difference which is equals to 100 minus the CC value. So when you look closely here, we had 90, now we have 10, which means it's 100 minus the CC value. So the CC value was 90. So it's 100 minus 90, which leaves us with 10. But then we have limitations using this method. So the first ordination figure that result does not explain the Y of the vegetation any better than the table method. If the axes do not lead to good separation of stands, then the next level of questioning concerns the meaning of the axes. Do they correlate with certain environmental factors? Do they represent the environmental gradients of major importance to plant and community distribution? It will be difficult to relate environmental factors in any exact way to the axis because species stands will not respond to any factor in a linear fashion. Remember, we're dealing with organisms, so they cannot respond in a linear manner because these are living organisms. So this second, since the aim of the ordination is not the separation of stands into association, the results do not lend themselves to the aim of the community classification. Thirdly, the original data of stands and species are lost to the reader because most research papers that include ordination, they do not include raw data, so the reader cannot get much more from the ordination graph than what the author concluded from it. And lastly, the array of stands in ordination may be changed by selecting a different CC formula or by choosing the reference stands differently.